Thank you, everyone, for coming to today's presentation. It's on the 77th anniversary of the very first, and so far only, touch wood, attack on Sydney and Newcastle, which occurred 77 years ago today in 1942. Today's presentation is a combination of like the good old PowerPoint with a whole lot of slides, but they're not slides which most folks here have ever seen, because I have included Japanese images of the actual attack afterwards from their magazines and newspapers at the time. And at the conclusion of our presentation, which Michael from Art and I will be doing, I've got a little bag at the front there which has got the original magazines from World War II from Japan, which many of the images were sourced from the Second World War. And we also have a selection of objects which were actually involved in the attacks on both Sydney and Newcastle. And we also have some artworks which Michael has told me are not on our public website scanned, but you can look at them here today as part of our commemorations. As I said before, this is the anniversary of the very first of two Japanese attacks on Sydney in 1942. The very first attack being today on the 31st of May and also the 1st of June 1942. A week later, the first and only attack on the Steel City of Newcastle fell on the night of the 8th of June 1942. Both of these incidents claimed Australian, British, American and Japanese lives. The Japanese lost 6 highly trained sailors in the very first raid. During the second attack on Sydney, the only fatality was a young American fighter pilot who crashed his aircraft just after takeoff from Bankstown Airport, and his aircraft, which was an Aerocobra, crashed at a place called Hammondville, which is right at the front of what they call Holsworthy Army Base in Sydney. And there's a park named for him there, which is called Lieutenant, which is the American way of saying it, Lieutenant George Canteller. He was from Corpus Christi, Texas, and I've met his son a few years ago when he came here. These two attacks are highly significant, being the first time that the population-dense southeastern part of the Australian mainland was directly attacked by a foreign military. These attacks both failed militarily, with the midget submarines missing their intended target, the USS Chicago, which was a heavy cruiser, which had just survived Pearl Harbor a few months earlier, and had come into Sydney and just got through that attack. This miss on the on the USS Canberra saw the inadvertent sinking of a converted Sydney ferry called the HMAS Cuttable. In this raid, 19 Australian and 2 British sailors were killed. The two British sailors had been on survivor's leave in Sydney, having one of them survived the sinking of the HMS Repulse off Malaya on 10th of December 1941, and a few months later with the HMS Dorset, which was a British heavy cruiser sunk in the Indian Ocean. So both those poor young British sailors survived their sinkings and then were killed in this attack on Sydney. And as I said before, the only fatality from the second attack was a young American pilot called George Canteller. The first attack was a midget submarine raid using 3 battery-powered 2-man submarines. People go, battery-powered? No, literally it's like your car batteries. And you can see on the one we've got in Anzac Hall, you'll see where the banks of the forward rows of the batteries were kept by the mountings on the inside of the skin of the submarine. The second attack was launched off the coast of both Sydney and Newcastle from giant I-class mother submarines, using a 140mm deck gun, which fired into the urban built-up areas of both Newcastle and Sydney. And I have one of the shells down here which was recovered from a golf course in eastern Sydney the day after the attack, after it was deloused and made safe, and we've got it here. We've got another one of these shells on display in the Second World War gallery as well, if you wanted to see that one there. The attacks had several effects. They garnered Australian resolve to fight back. It saw thousands of people leave Sydney for safer inland areas. Basically, real estate in eastern Sydney was going for a really good price, and people moving to Katoomba and to Penrith and other places. It exposed the lack of Australian anti-submarine defences and shocked the partly complacent Australian population into taking the threat of war more seriously. The memorial holds a range of very significant objects from this attack, including a composite submarine in Anzac Hall, which is made from two subs out of Sydney, not one complete submarine. If you want to look at the middle bridge part of the other submarine, which was fished out of Sydney Harbour, that's on display at the Navy Heritage Centre at like HMAS Cuttable in Sydney. Problem is, getting there, Sundays only, and it's by ferry. You can't drive into the base and go in there. You've got to go by ferry. Now, the other objects which we've got here, of course, includes the wheelhouse of HMAS Cuttable, which was the victim of the first attack, and that's on display in Anzac Hall as well. And we have the remains of 2 torpedoes which were fired in Sydney Harbour. The end part of the one that exploded underneath the Cuttable, and the one which ran aground, which is on display in Anzac Hall. Smaller items in our national collection include personal effects from Japanese midget submarine crewmen. We've got a few here today, which have taken off. One of them is a name tag off one of the men's jackets, and also some good luck talismans, which have also been in the collection for 75 years or so. And we have, of course, one of the deactivated Japanese naval shells here, which was fired at Sydney. And as I said before, Michael will introduce later on some of the artworks as to what we've brought along here, and they'll be at the front here. So if later on we're finished, please come towards the front and mill around and have a look. This attack on Sydney was a real international affair. There was even an Indian Navy ship in Sydney Harbour which responded to the attack. So the Indian Navy were actually in Sydney Harbour the night of the attack, and it was an Australian-made and designed Bathurst-class corvette called the Bombay. So it was made at Cockatoo Island. It was in Sydney doing practice runs, and then with its crew, and then they're under attack. Of course, you've got the Americans involved. You've got the British sailors being killed, and the commander of like all the naval forces in Sydney was a British admiral, Admiral Gerard Muirhead Gould. 2 controversies followed him from this raid. I'll discuss one in a minute, but the first one is that during the attack, he allowed the ships to keep on moving on Sydney Harbour. So instead of telling everyone, get to the shore and come ashore, he said, keep everyone going on the harbour in order to keep the Japanese submarines down underwater so that they would think that the ship above them could be wanting to hunt them when it's your local pleasure craft or your ferry. That, of course, had problems, though, because it exposes the public to machine gun fire bursts off American and Australian ships, because Australian and American ships were firing machine guns and also a 5-inch cannon off the USS Chicago, which hit the side of Fort Denison. And if you go to Fort Denison, which is closed at the moment, I've been told by a mate of mine in Sydney, for renovations, you can see divots out of the side of like Fort Denison from the USS Chicago. And so there was also originally supposed to be 4 Japanese midget submarines, not 3. But like the mother submarine of the 4th one was sunk on its way from to Truck Harbour from Japan. So therefore there's only 3 submarines involved, not 4 mini submarines floating around Sydney Harbour. These men were also not kamikazes. They were not suicide attackers. They actually did have a plan to get out of Sydney Harbour. And in fact, of the 3 submarines, the one that did get out and actually headed in the opposite direction, which is interesting, to where he was supposed to meet up with his mother sub. These attacks on Sydney and Newcastle became propaganda tools for the Japanese as well. The crews involved in both the Sydney and Madagascar attacks were all posthumously promoted 2 ranks up and given war god status, and their remains are still held in Japan at like the Yasukuni War Shrine, along with other famous and infamous Japanese servicemen. The USS Chicago, which survived Pearl Harbor and then later on in Sydney, later on was sunk in the Solomon Islands in 1943, so its luck ended up running out. And it also narrowly missed being sunk, very controversially, in a battle called Savo Island, which is in Guadalcanal. It's the biggest ever US military defeat at sea, and Australia lost our heavy cruiser Canberra, and we lost 84 Australian men. The captain of the Canberra was basically chided for running away from the battle in the very dark, confusing Japanese-dominated night battle, which saw 3 American heavy cruisers and 1 Australian cruiser sunk. The Captain Bode, later actually took his own life, sadly, having been made fun of and derided by his own colleagues in the US Navy. I'll now start with a couple of these slides I've got here. The introduction I've just given as well. The aim of the presentation is to commemorate these two attacks on Sydney and Newcastle 77 years ago this week in May and June of 1942. It's to better educate our visitors and staff and to also show some very rarely seen objects and artworks from our collection. Of course, in addition to what we've got on display. At the end of the presentation, you'll hopefully have a better understanding as to the impact of this of these raids, and also on like the larger context of why they were launched. The attack on Sydney was actually designed to be an attack to spread Allied interest around the Pacific theatre, hoping that they could eventually have a main fleet-on-fleet action, which is what the Japanese had planned for decades, to have the main American fleet take on the main Japanese fleet in the open sea and then be defeated using battleships on each other. But as it turned out, the major decisive battle which happened in the Pacific in 1942 was the Battle of Midway, which is also discussed in one of the artworks here, where the Japanese didn't lose any battleships, but they lost a much more valuable aircraft carrier. They lost 4 of their main aircraft carriers, which then turned the tide, which was the beginning of the turning of the tide in the whole Pacific theatre. Only a few weeks before Sydney was attacked, there was a battle of Coral Sea off the coast of Townsville, which prevented the Japanese seaborne invasion of Port Moresby, which then made them have to go via land, which is over the Kokoda Trail, and also trying to flank around through Milne Bay. So that's part of the larger context. Now, midget submarines had already been used by the Japanese. They used them in Pearl Harbor. Most people think of just the American warplanes, Josh Hartnett coming in his aeroplane, and Ben Affleck and all that sort of stuff. That movie, I'm not kidding, it's out of accuracy, it's about 2 out of 10, as for a nerd like me. But the Japanese did use these two-man submarines in Pearl Harbor. They failed. In fact, one of the Japanese became the very first Japanese POW of the Americans. Very shameful, Mr. Sakamaki. And he was totally written out of Japanese wartime depictions of the attack on Pearl Harbor. His submarine beached itself on a beach, and he did not shoot himself. He came ashore and surrendered. He'd been training for 18 months for the job, and the day of his action, he probably couldn't. I don't know why he didn't go ahead with his mission, but he actually became a POW. The midget submarines were not designed to be originally to be used in harbours. They're actually not really good for harbour work because they're long. And you saw the one in Anzac Hall. If you haven't seen it, it's at the back. It's really hard to turn around. It's really hard. But in a harbour, you need to have a nice, small, zippy sort of submarine. In our temporary exhibition up in Anzac Hall, in the mezzanine up the top, we've got an exhibition on D-Day, on the commemoration for D-Day. One of the models we've got on display is an X-boat, and that's a British-designed midget submarine, which is much, much better suited for like harbour work. And you'll see how short it is scaled out to like with a little figurine in the actual model. So yeah, they were designed to be used in open sea, but they never got to use them in that way. They used them only in harbour attacks. This is a Japanese map of Sydney and also of the east coast of Australia, which depicts lovely harbour bridge here in the bottom. And so Japanese were quite familiar with Sydney Harbour, being allies of Australia from 1909 or so to like the 1930s, with regular fleet visits and visits by officer training schools, ships. This is a map during the war after the attack on Sydney, which proudly in red ink shows you the date 31/5/17, which is the Japanese way of marking the age of the year back then, the 31st day of May in Showa 17, which means the 17th year of the reign of Emperor Hirohito. So that means 1942. So the year 17 is that. Originally it means 4017 is its original date. And the context of this map was to show Japanese readers back home the size of Japan relative to Australia, and also it shows you occupied Indonesia and Timor. It doesn't show you occupied Papua, but it does show you the islands just north of Guadalcanal being occupied by the Japanese, which is up there on the map, and it shows you the land mass, what's like arable land, and also this map here indicates our industry and our capacity and so forth. But the main thing is it does show you a bomb hitting Darwin, and also marks indicating Japanese attacks on northern Australia, the Torres Strait, Cooktown, and it doesn't mention Townsville though yet being attacked as well. Before the attacks on Sydney, the Japanese had already launched submarine-launched aircraft over Sydney and Melbourne and over Auckland and over Wellington. They used fold-up aeroplanes. And you can hear one at the start of our submarine show. Sadly, it doesn't show you what the plane looks like, but it's a really small-looking aeroplane. It's got 2 men inside, and it's a fold-up plane with 10 parts. And it's launched off the front deck of a submarine. It's an amazing bit of kit, and it was codenamed Glen, as in the male name Glen, Glen. And they flew that before the attacks on Sydney, and one after it. All up, 4 Japanese float planes flew over Sydney. 4 missions over Sydney Heads, which is amazing. Of course, Darwin, as the record, was 64. Main bomber attacks and dive bombers and so forth. But Melbourne had the aircraft launched off their port, and the one down over Hobart flew out of Oyster Bay here on the east coast. They were basically checking out what was around these harbours to see what was worth hitting with the midget subs, and they decided eventually to go for Sydney. The other option was Suva, and they also flew the same submarine aircraft over Noumea and also Fiji, and funnily enough over Durban in South Africa. They were checking out stuff all over the place before the attacks on Sydney, looking for options. This is another Japanese World War II magazine depicting the attack on Sydney, as well as the almost simultaneous attack on Madagascar. Notice you've got Tokyo measurements here, goes to Sydney, and it shows you a sunken ship and a sunken ship over here, and it gives you relative distances as well to the east coast of America, to Pearl Harbor and so forth. A lot of people don't realise that the attack on Sydney happened a few hours after this attack, which was by the exact same team of submariners. They actually had their special attack group set up in the Eastern Attack Group of Sydney and the Western Attack Group of Madagascar. Now, this had just been taken off the Vichy French only a month or so earlier. So when the attack happened, and you've got a British oil tanker sinking and burning in Diego Suarez Harbour, and a submarine-launched torpedo had hit a battleship called the Ramillies, it put a 3 by 3 metre hole in the side of the ship. One of those submarine-launched torpedoes, which ran ashore in Sydney and hit underneath the old Cuttable. It put a 9 metre square hole in a battleship. And the British assumed, for the first day or so, it was Vichy French saboteurs. So they didn't put the call out to everyone saying, hey, they're using mini-subs on harbours now. They thought it was actually Vichy French. Eventually, one of the 2 crew drowned in their submarine, which is still missing today, off Madagascar. But the one that got in, fired the torpedoes, they ditched their submarine and walked overland over 80 kilometres to the evacuation beach. They were then tracked and killed by British troops on the evacuation beach. So the Japanese sailors, they're the same team that were the same guys that went into Sydney. They had any way they could get out, they got out. In the case of Sub-Lieutenant Ban in Sydney, he escaped and went left up towards Newcastle when he should have gone right towards Wollongong. We don't know why, but the speculation is he thought he was being followed, we think. And he didn't want the Aussies and the Americans to follow him back to the mother submarine. So he took his own life with his petty officer off Freshwater Beach near Manly in Sydney. And the other submarine crew escaped overland, and they almost got off and away. So don't ever think these guys are suicide kamikaze people. They weren't. But they were very highly trained, and they were they expected to be killed, but they didn't hope, I guess. Another Japanese World War II depiction of Sydney, and also the harbour. And you've got what's now, of course, Bennelong Point. You've got the old tram sheds there, which is now Opera House, and the Harbour Bridge and so forth. And this is just a bit of a guide for people in Japan to see what Sydney's like. This is a Japanese World War II depiction of what happened in Sydney. That's what they reckon was a cuttable. So in their media back in Japan, they claimed a heavy cruiser, and this says Sydney Harbour attack, and it has the mini submarine here firing its torpedo. You can see the torpedo track hitting the side of the ship, and it's a US battleship looking ship, not a converted Sydney ferry made out of wood, which had the torpedo hit underneath her, and it broke her back, and she sank within seconds. I remember talking to a HMAS Cuttable, to a guy who was a diver, and he told me when I was younger that when he went down to cut some of the guys loose out of their bunks, he said they were wrapped up like cocoons. They were in their not their bunks, their hammocks, and because of the sudden rush of water, they'd been flipped and rotated in their hammocks, and he said it was like cutting cocoons off underwater, about 5 metres, he said. Japanese torpedoes, by the way, that they fired in Sydney Harbour were set too deep. They were found to be set for 5 and 6 metres deep. You can tell because on the back of the torpedo there's like little notches to indicate your depth and your angle. And so they set them too deep, and that's why one of them passed under a Dutch submarine. And that was the other country I failed to mention at the start of the talk. International affair for Sydney Harbour, there was a Dutch submarine with a really cool name, K9. K9. It was a survivor from the Dutch Navy in Indonesia. It come to Sydney, it limped in, it wasn't in a good nick, and that torpedo, which actually hit the cuttable, went underneath her. So she was sitting there right next to the cuttable. This is a depiction of what is Northern California and Oregon being hit by a Japanese deck gun on a submarine. So later on you get to check out one of these shells. This is what's being fired out of one of these things. Now notice here you've got the Japanese falsely claim that they set fire to a major oil refinery on the coast of California in late 1942. They were actually going to attack California on like Christmas Day and Boxing Day, 1942, but bad weather prevented their attack. But they were launching shells, and they did launch them in minor attacks up there and also in Canada. So don't just think it was Newcastle and Sydney who copped these artillery shells. British Columbia was attacked, and also California, Oregon, and Western Australia. So it's a really wasteful use of a major fleet asset to just fling shells into areas because it's not accurate. Your submarine is pitching left and right, it's going up and down, and you've got a gun that's trying to aim that's 10, 15 kilometres away. So you can imagine that like the dispersion of the rounds is crazy. It's not accurate and designed clearly for harassment and for more of like political reasons and also for psychological reasons in the case of the attacks on Sydney, because it actually had a negative effect against the Japanese. On the attack on Sydney, they used the deck gun on the front of the sub, and they sailed directly at Bondi, and they fired 10 shots into Sydney, heading towards Sydney because the gun was on the front deck of the sub. On the one on Newcastle, that submarine, the I-21, had a hangar for the aircraft on the front deck, a waterproof clamshell door hangar. So they couldn't mount the gun on the front, it was at the back. So the one on Newcastle, the submarine, approached Newcastle, then did a U-turn and then fired as it was leaving. But it fired 34 shells at Newcastle. So 3 times the number of shells what was launched at Sydney were fired at Newcastle. And the ones in Newcastle were actually landing in and around its intended target of the BHP steelworks. So they actually had their shot better, and they used star shells, which is like illumination flares. Yeah. That's what the gun looks like compared to these young sailors on the wooden deck of the submarine firing and using them. They used to use these guns to shoot merchant ships. So if you're in the middle of the Indian Ocean or like the Pacific Ocean and you're on these submarines and you see a small looking ship which is not armed, that's when you use the deck gun. You don't waste a really rare one of your 20 torpedoes. You save them for the big fat juicy naval targets. You use the deck gun to punch holes in ships. So that's what a deck gun is really for. But when it's used on a coastal position, also these guns did not use flashless ammunition, which means when they fired the gun, there was a huge red bang in front of your face, a big flash. That gives our defenders something to aim at. But it's very hard to aim at a flash every few seconds because it's moving, and it's really hard to get range because during daylight you can get range easier. Optimally, you want a radar to try and pick up the ship as it comes above the water, but there was no radar sets for anti-submarine use in Sydney. But that's what a deck gun used, and it's 140 millimetres, so 14 centimetres is how fat the shell is. And I was told this morning by a submariner from the Australian Navy that this shell is the biggest shell used by the Japanese Navy on their submarines because it's the only one, it's like the heaviest weight you can carry for one person to load into the back of the gun at 25 kilos when it's been fired. So it's obviously heavier when it's got its propellant and so forth with it. This is in our collection. We've got our research centre has got a superb collection of objects of actual documentation which goes into the attacks on Sydney and Newcastle. They're all been scanned, which is fabulous. So you can just look them up on our website. And this is, of course, a secret document about like the attacks on Sydney and Newcastle, slamming our own communications, which was very bad. It's one of the things which come out of this attack, how poorly coordinated our defences were, and how little real anti-submarine training our Navy had. We did not have a single submarine in the Australian Navy in World War II. Not one. And that old K9, we actually ended up using it for training people to look what it to see what it looks like when it's doing its job and to practice their ASDIC or their sonar pinging off it as practice after the attack on Sydney. This is one of the intelligence reports in our collection, which talks about some of these shells. 95% of the shells failed to explode. Some of the shells were found to be British manufacture from World War I. So they were using pretty old, like 25-plus-year-old ammunition of like the British Navy, made by the British Navy. They were impacting into homes, into walls, into the ocean, into Double Bay in Sydney and Rose Bay. So presumably there's a couple of shells at the bottom of Sydney Harbour. And also Newcastle had a whole bunch land on the Hunter River as well. This is Newcastle here for you, if you know Newcastle at all, and you've got the Hunter River up here. You've got the BHP inland a bit from Newcastle. This place here, Fort Scratchley, fired back. Sydney didn't fire back, but Newcastle fired back. And they fired 4 shots back at the 34 being given to them by the Japanese. And the Japanese fired in a position on a bearing of 67 degrees from Fort Scratchley. You can see the initial range that they thought it was 4,000 yards. They then tried at 7,000 yards, but the reality was they were down here. So we were firing halfway to the Japanese submarines, it turned out. And this position was reported, triangulated, if you can imagine a line being drawn from Wiper's observation post, OP. They've drawn a line out to where they said the flash, okay? Oh, and I'll go back. And the Fort Scratchley battery, and the Wallace battery have drawn a line out there as well. And where these 3 lines intersect is where your target is. But these guys operating on their own information fired 4 shots and they fell short. On the right bearing at the flash, but they fell short. And these dots indicate where the Japanese shells fell. In and around BHP works in Newcastle, in the Hunter River, near the Wallace battery. So presumably they've seen, and it's you can see where some have fallen short. So if you draw a line from there, some have fallen short around there, which would be likely be their first few shots. And in Newcastle, they've aimed for Fort Scratchley and the very densely populated part of Newcastle here. If you ever want to go, if you're in Newcastle, go to their museum. It's really good. They've got a really good setup there. They've got people who dress up in the uniforms and they do the shots. And whenever the HMAS Newcastle comes into shore, they fire off a saluting gun as well. Another Japanese depiction of Sydney after the attack on Sydney, and here they're basically saying, we sank a British battleship in Diego Suarez, Madagascar, and we sunk a cruiser in Sydney Harbour. So that's why you've got up there the line pointing at Madagascar for the western group of the special attack guys, and the eastern guys down here in Sydney. And there's my beautiful city of birth. Now, when the Admiral Muirhead Gould did the other thing he did was he actually had the Japanese sailors' bodies recovered out of the submarines, and they were given a full military funeral, witnessed by the Swiss Consul General. And they filmed it, and they recorded it, and they gave the Japanese ambassador and his team from here in Canberra at the embassy, they were all put on a boat called the Kamikawa Maru, which is this boat here, and their ship left Sydney, went to Portuguese Africa, and then went from there to Japan in a clearly marked neutral ship. And this is them coming into Yokohama in Japan with the remains of these 4 men and the entire delegation of the Japanese embassy from Australia, along with a whole bunch of Japanese civilians. And with them, they had the remains in these boxes of each of the 4 submariners and the footage of their bodies being cremated at the Eastern Sydney Crematorium in Botany in Sydney, and they were given a full-on salute. Now, people in Australia, some people, they really criticised the British commander of Sydney Harbour for what he did, but he basically said he's got a really good speech about that like their bravery doesn't mean that you're from Australia, from Britain, America, Japan. This is bravery of an amazing level. He said he wouldn't even have the guts to get in one of those midget submarines and cross Sydney Harbour. He said these guys come in through Sydney, and they did an attack at night, very confusing, with limited light and conditions. Of your 2 men on board the sub, you've got 1 officer who actually steers and commands it, and you've got a petty officer who does a lot of the movement and working and stuff, and moves the ballast and so forth around, which is basically a counterweight to help compensate for the torpedoes being fired. Anyway, these 4 guys got returned, and Japanese media told people of Japan this is what Australia's done. These are the relatives of the 4 men down here, and these are the 4 remains in these boxes. And they've been given a full naval salute, and you've got little kids in Japanese Navy uniforms as well, along with some veterans as well. So this was no other country did this in World War II. The Japanese, in some limited accounts by like Hank Nelson, the famous Australian author and researcher into POWs, he said that only a couple of Aussie POWs were told. They're all told that Sydney was attacked and that many ships were sunk. But like the Australians are very honoured by actually returning the remains of their sailors. This is a memorial to the 10 Japanese sailors that were killed in the attacks on Sydney and Madagascar. So this shows you who they are, and this is a note which was written by one of the crewmen dedicating his spirit and his heart to their mission to do whatever it's needed to protect the Emperor and the Japanese Empire. The other attack on Australia, which come a few months later, the following year, was Port Gregory, up north of Geraldton, and that was on the 28th of January 1943 by the I-165. Now, that's that deck gun on the front deck, and that's just a normal sort of Japanese submarine. Doesn't carry any midget subs on the back, and it didn't carry any Glens on the front. They fired 10 shots at an unmanned Australian position there, a radio mast. They missed it, but they claim they did hit it. And when they reported a week later to Japan that, we've attacked Port Gregory, that was when Allied signals intelligence intercepted it, and they then sent a team up to go and investigate the damage to go see what happened. So the Allies were reading the Japanese mail at that point, and that's when we realised, they had actually fired 10 shots at Port Gregory. It's an amazing little thing. So both east and west coast of Australia got attacked by Japanese submarines firing deck guns. The attacks on Sydney and Newcastle, which occurred 77 years ago this week, were very significant to the history of Australia and in the Pacific War. You had 21 Australian and British sailors killed in the very first attack and 6 Japanese submariners. And a week later, you had 1 American fighter pilot killed who was trying to respond to the second attack. These attacks are portrayed in our galleries in Anzac Hall with the composite Japanese Type A midget submarine out there, and we've got a show on every hour, on the quarter hour, I believe. I might be corrected there, on the actual show, on the attack. Thank you so much for coming along and checking out what we've this part of the presentation. In a minute, I'll be going down the front here, and if you want to look at any of those original Japanese magazines and papers and stuff, you can have a look at them. I've also brought along 2 books which are really good books on this subject by the one author, Battle Surface and Hitting Home, and they're by David Jenkins. And one's basically a light sort of little coffee top sort of version, and the other one's more thicker for us nerds who love the whole detail and history of the whole thing. And I've also got like the Japanese shell which hit the golf links in Sydney, and Michael's got some artworks down the front here. Did you want to introduce any of the artworks from up here, Michael, or do you want to just do it from down there? Okay, cool. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for coming along. If you want to come check out stuff, please do. Thank you.